Hey there, this is Michał from LearnUX.io. In this lesson I will go through the design process step by step to show you what the consecutive steps should be in the design process and what are the actions a UX designer would do in all of them. A design process could be visualized in 1,000 different ways, and I think that every company has their own, and all of the steps, the stages, the philosophy that encompasses all of it, this might differ from industry to industry or from company to company. In my opinion, the design process, called the double diamond process, is the most general way that allows me to explain to you what the process, the design process, should look like in terms of the ways of thinking and the consecutive stages of it. The double diamond model was developed by Design Council. It's an organization based in the UK who are focusing on educating people about design, about the processes and best practices that you could use when designing both digital and physical products. So let's go through the double diamond process. The first step is the problem, is the initiation point. Every project or every product needs a problem to be solved. And this could originate from a business problem, like the sales are dropping, or it could originate from a user problem, meaning that users are struggling with doing a certain action in their lives, and you and your digital product are trying to solve it for them to make life a little bit easier for them. When you go through the stages of the design process right until the final solution, then you go through phases of divergent and convergent thinking. The divergent thinking is you exploring all the different possibilities, whether are the problems that you want to solve or the possible solutions that you might generate. Then you have the convergent thinking, which means that you're focusing on, you gathered all these information or all these ideas and you're trying to define the single one or at least a couple of small iterations of the one that you think is the best. The first stage of the process is the discover stage. This is where you and your team would try to understand what the real problem is. Quite often the problem that the client or your stakeholder came to you with is just a symptom. The dropping sales might mean that your customers are not just not buying things. It might mean that they're not interested in your brand anymore, or because there was a PR issue that you didn't address. So the possible problems are very wide, and this is also why you have the divergent thinking in this stage. You need to explore all the different possible problems or needs that you could address with your product. Only then, after you gathered all the information, you could try to define what the main problem that you want to tackle is. And the main problem might be that people are not interested, let's say, in the museum that you're designing some information for. They may not be interested in the brand anymore because they grew out of it. Maybe they became a bit older and the young feeling doesn't really resonate with them. The problems might be very, very much different from industry to industry and from company to company. And your role as a designer is to understand all of them and define the ones that you would like to tackle in the next design process. Once you and your team agree on a problem to solve, then there is the develop stage, where you would go through all of the iterations that you need, that you have time for, in order to generate ideas, concepts, wireframes or prototypes of the final solutions. And still you have the divergent thinking here, so you explore different things. Very rarely does it happen that you have one idea and it's the best idea from the start. You don't need to iterate on it, it works straight away. Well, the real design process doesn't look like that. This is why we have the divergent thing here. The last stage of the design process is, again, convergent thinking, where you try to understand all of the possible solutions that are available and honing in on the best ones. So you choose which prototypes, which concepts are the best through several iterations, through several rounds of testing. You select those ones, you implement them, which usually in digital products mean that you go through the UI design stage and then the development stage, that the final idea, the final solution is implemented. And this is, in theory, the end of the design process. To make it more tangible to you, let's go through some examples of what a UX designer or any other person involved with UX design would do at each step of the design process. Let's start with the problem, the brief. Usually you would get a brief document or some sort of a meeting with a stakeholder from the company you're working in or from a client that you would work with. And the brief usually outlines some of the problems that the company is facing, some of the problems that you would need to solve through a design process. The first stage would be research. And I look at it from three perspectives. First of all, you would need to interview some business stakeholders or conduct workshops with them to understand business objectives, business constraints, or any other requirements related to the business or organizational side of things. The second part is understanding the users, understanding their underlying problems and needs that you could address. That means basically empathizing with them on a human level, but also understanding their functions and how you could support them with your digital product. The third part is understanding the user experience. If the project means a redesign of an existing digital product, then you would need to go through evaluation of how the user experience is performing at this very moment, understanding the analytics or perhaps conducting usability testing with current users of the system. The next stage would be analysis. This is where you would go through all the knowledge that you gathered so far and trying to understand what the underlying problem is and what the organization that you're working for would need to be tackled. And this could mean you working alone and going through all the findings, all the insights, creating artifacts such as customer journey maps or personas. But it could also mean a series of workshops that you would do with a couple of other people on your design team or the business stakeholders. And this is actually the way that I prefer to do it. So you go together in a room, you list down all the observations that you had on post-it notes, and you try to cluster them into particular themes that you could later on explore or address in the design that you would create. And based on these themes, then you could create customer journey maps and personas, but they would be actually done in a way that the whole team understands the users or the business problems and empathize with everybody else involved in the process. It's a really great way to have the whole team working together from the start. After the whole team agrees upon the problem to be solved, you would need to move on to the ideation and prototyping phase. This is the most fun phase in the project because you go on and explore different creative solutions to the problem. You first define the architecture, the functions, every possible step that the user could go through. Then you move on to prototyping, which actually means designing particular screens and again going as wide as possible, trying to explore different possible solutions, different approaches or layouts, something that might finally fit the user needs and the business requirements. The last part of the process would be testing and UI design, which means that the wireframes, the prototypes that you gathered in the previous one, then you would go on testing with the users, ask everybody for feedback, and try to select the best ones. Then, of course, going further down into details, you would move into the UI design stage. Sometimes UX designers are not tackling the UI part on their own. There is a dedicated UI or product designer who basically works with the rest of the team to define the visual style of the application and to design particular screens and interactions for each of the prototypes, each of the screens. And there it is, the final step of the design process. So you went through all of these stages, originating from the problem through multiple stages of divergent and convergent thinking, finally arriving at the solution that would be implemented by the developers. You're pretty sure you will be happy about the design process to finally end and you could tackle the next one. And every time you tackle a design process, remember to go through all of these stages, at least in a tiny bit, to make sure that you're following the best practice of how you would work as a UX designer. So I hope that in this lesson I taught you how to understand UX design as a whole process or how the particular stages could be organized. In the next lessons, I will go in a little bit more detail about how all of this work is conducted and what are the required or the preferable skills for UX designers to have to work on all of these stages.